All right, good afternoon, folks, and welcome to Free Together, Free Apart Hacking Family Success, brought to you by the Vermont Center for Family Studies. I'm Erik Thompson. I'm the Executive Director of the Vermont Center for Family Studies, and I'm very happy to be here with you today. Very grateful to Dr. Walter Howard Smith Jr. for joining us today for our second conversation about a Bowen theory of race relations in America. And I'm just really looking forward to chatting with Walter again. His thoughts and ideas have been inspiring to me for many years. And just before I get going with Walter, I want to share with you our plan for today and also just tell you a little bit about what's going on with us, what's coming up. Also mention that we're grateful to Pomerleau Real Estate for sponsoring these events. If you're appreciating them, if you're sharing them with people, I want to encourage you to make a contribution. It's easy to donate to our organization on our website. There's a donate button there. Even if it's $10, if you feel like, hey, that was worth $10 for me, like going to a movie, we just appreciate it. We run these things on a very lean scale with a lot of volunteer energy. And our mission is to strengthen families and make our community better. So thank you so much to those of you who have supported us as well. And wanted to mention what we have coming up, which is third year in a row that I'm organizing a conference on that's looking at the interaction or the relationship, potential relationship between differentiation of self and higher stages of human development as they have been explored in wisdom traditions, including meditation traditions. The conference is not so much about a technique, about a meditation technique. It's more about what these traditions understand about higher stages of the self de-embedded from objects of experience. What mindfulness is there an interaction or relationship between mindfulness and differentiation of self? Where's the line between that? And it's going to be a 2-day adventure with 2 different research scientists who've explored these things empirically, one from the USC and one from Maharishi International University. And next week, on Wednesday, a different day for us, we're going to have a preview of that with those 2 scientists. I'll be talking with them next week, next Wednesday. So that, and then the week after that, Cami Kelton is going to interview me about the conference. So if you're kind of curious about this conference, that's a way to know a little bit more about it. Okay, Walter, how are you, sir?
It's good to be here. Thanks for inviting me back.
Walter, how's your summer been?
Summer's been good. I live in a very small bubble, given the COVID, and but with that, it's been a good summer and productive, well connected with people. Lots of classical guitar.
You mean listening or playing?
I try to play.
You do?
I listen better than I play. I'll put it that way.
Huh. So are you retired, Walter?
So I've retired from places, but I am not retired. I won't ever quit working. As you may know, I don't work.
That's kind of a bonus. Wait a minute.
I just work at my missions. You know, I've had these life missions and I just do things toward them. So, but I'm gonna never stop.
All right. Well, I want to just mention that what Walter Smith, those of you who don't know Dr. Smith, what he retired from is a distinguished career in public service, running a very large organization in Pittsburgh that was focused on helping families, helping kids. He's had a very, very scholarly journey with this topic of abuse, very grounded scholarly journey, dealing with it on the front lines at the same time, writing about it. And if you want to read an amazing, an example of someone applying Bowen theory to a really intense symptom, look up his paper on abuse that I have guided you to in our previous conversation, which you can find on our YouTube channel. You can see the reference for this, this article that Walter wrote. It's not an easy article to read a paper to read, but it's fascinating. So can you just say a little bit more about this? You don't work. You said, I know that, but I did not know that you never work.
Yeah, I mean,
Does it feel like work?
some years ago, I kind of put myself on this mission to sort of do things that are really important to me, and it just so
Yeah.
happens that those things I've gotten paid for over the years, and
Mm.
so that's worked out pretty well. But I don't see myself sort of as working as much as getting up every day and going about, the things that give me a sense of purpose and meaning.
Doesn't feel like work.
Sometimes they feel like work, so I can't say they never feel like work. But in general, and sometimes they're really hard. I mean, child abuse prevention is difficult. Working at a child welfare agency, it was painful, but I think this idea about meaning and purpose, like, is there something I can do to contribute to making this world just a little bit better, if not a lot better? So by taking on a really tough issue and seeing, what can we do to make a difference? And some of that got started because my mother was a social worker, and she was really big on promoting for my brother and I this notion that, we got to do something about the world. We just can't sit in it. And she was active in civil rights. And from high school days, I was a volunteer, and I was out there seeing if I could do something. So it's the helper part of
A
me. And
very high sense of meaning in your life.
very much so.
Strong sense of
Very
meaning.
much so. I've been fortunate that way, and that I've been able to translate the meaning into a living.
They say now there's all this research. Have you been following this research on eudaimonic happiness?
I have no idea what that is.
Well, they said there's these two different kinds of happiness, hedonistic and eudaimonic. The eudaimonic kind is very different than the hedonistic kind. And people with the eudaimonic kind tend to live longer. And the eudaimonic kind has a lot to do with meaning, a meaningful life.
Yeah, I don't know about that. I'm glad to hear it. I hope it applies. It's a tricky thing to define, isn't it? So it tends to be pretty personal, and for me, I do set goals. I'm very goal driven about what I'm doing. And there certainly have been moments when it's been hard to stay focused on child abuse. I've almost given up the effort a couple times. But I've gone back to it because I think in the end, it's a way to make a contribution.
Yeah, and in our first talk, we did pivot back and forth between child abuse and racism, two very intense symptoms, two painful symptoms. Do you want to take a shot at speaking something about the link between these two symptoms? Do you see them as?
Yeah, I'd say one question. What I kind of do is walk around, Eric, with these questions, these sort of larger questions that guide kind of what I'm thinking about. And I would say, so I was thinking about, is racism a symptom, and what's the larger emotional process that it reflects? So that's one I've been thinking about for a long time. So certainly child abuse as a symptom, and what is the larger process that it reflects in families, has been one I've been thinking about for about 35 years. And, it's an interesting challenge to think about either one of those as a symptom, and also to understand the larger process. With child abuse, I do think there is a larger process there, a larger emotional process in families. And there are some rather predictable patterns that lead to a parent, an older sibling, focusing on a child in an aggressive way, either through neglect or through sexual or physical violence or through verbal aggression. Racism is just so interesting because, this country has this long history, not just with African Americans, not just with Native Americans, but with lot of ethnic groups, sort of being the recipient of a projection process, projection of aggression and control. Certainly with African Americans and Native Americans, we've been in the lens of that projection process for a long time, if not from the beginning. So, but it's interesting to think about what is the larger process, if and it just raises lots of questions about that. And certainly, you see fluctuations in the intensity of that projection. Certainly, you could say maybe even gradually over long periods of time for some groups, the intensity of that projection has decreased some, or at least shifted some. But with child abuse in families, what's really common is that, which I think I tried to write about that in that article, but I certainly have talked about, is that, for example, in a family where there's sexual abuse and it's been going on for a while, the family can actually become stable with a really severe symptom, meaning that they can sort of normalize sexual abuse, which to an outsider looks like, how in the hell did you normalize that, But for the members of the family, it's almost as if it becomes something that does not trigger, strong reactivity after a while.
Wow.
And then somebody comes in and disrupts it, and the symptom stops. And you see this escalation of anxiety in the family. And lots of other symptoms can break out. It could be, the marriage separates, there's lots of conflict and tension, there's other kinds of symptoms, depression, maybe the aggressor becomes suicidal or, whatever. But there's lots of symptoms that can emerge. So you can actually have families be relatively stable with a symptom over a long period, and then that symptom gets disrupted, and then you see this escalation of anxiety throughout the family. So you wonder, like with racism, if our average level of racial bias or our projection on a group declines, does anxiety increase in society? It's an interesting question to think about. I don't know the answer to that. I know this summer, the Black Lives Movement has really sort of kicked off, sort of national efforts to try to reduce systemic structural racism, and that's a whole other kind of topic. But it'd be interesting to think about, like to what degree is the larger process going to be reflected by, as we reduce that symptom, will we see more anxiety in other places? So it's interesting. One thought I always had about, sometimes people, I think in our field would talk about, societal regression. An example of that may be since the 1960s, we've had societal regression. And I've often thought, I wonder if there's not an alternative hypothesis. And that would be, at about the time when we started to, have civil rights, more equality in terms of race, more equality in terms of women and gender, which maybe decrease the projection process. Do we actually see more anxiety in society from the 60s because we have some groups not so much in the lens of focus of a societal projection process? Just another interesting way of looking at it rather than simply societal regression. But anyway, one of the questions I run around with is the one you just asked, which is, what is the larger process involved in either racism or child abuse? Child abuse is declining generally over the last decade. I don't know what that means in general, but it is declining generally in America.
How significantly, Walter? Do you have a sense of that?
Pretty significant, in terms of just incidents, and this would be declining in the population. There does appear to be, the data I saw is that it may be, 20%, less in the population. But there have been ups and downs over decades of time. Went down a bit in the early 90s and back up again. But during the last, 10, 20 years, it's a general decline. I don't know what that means or what that's all about or what the impact of that is.
And I just want to mention to those listening that if you're new to Zoom, you can choose the option to have your screen on speaker view, and then you'll have a fuller picture of Walter when he's speaking, and see some of the facial gestures as well. Or you can choose gallery view where you see a bunch of the other people in the audience.
I do think there's a larger process, and I think this idea of structural or systemic racism, I think people are trying to get to something bigger than just individual bias. Each person who has maybe a negative view of an ethnic group, like African Americans. So I think there's something, people are trying to get to something bigger. I think as I've been listening, I don't think many of those people have a family emotional systems view of things, or a systems view of things, or an emotional systems view of things. But I think they're trying to get to this thing in terms of structural racism, because it seems to be pretty resistant to change. So it's not, racism is not something that's easily changed at a social level.
It's hard to get a systems view.
Yeah.
It's not
if
easy.
You ask people,
you said this.
Do they agree with it?
I had a quote up about you saying that you had to calm down in order to achieve a systems view. And I totally relate to that about self-injury that I spent 15 years in, that I could not see it, a systems view of that for years early into it, with all the anxiety swirling around it. So, and I'm really interested in what you think might be a systems view of racism.
So I do think, thinking about the overall polarization in society, and how much does, some of these isms, where we project, blame, hold other groups responsible for some of the social ills, part of a larger process of polarization. Polarization to me, is more complicated than just two sides. I think it's easy sometimes for people to reduce it down to two sides. But I think it is sometimes the naturally occurring differences that occur among people getting ramped up with just anxiety. I think in a calmer environment, differences actually are attractive or interesting.
Yeah.
I think they're part of creativity and innovation. But if you rank up the anxiety, particularly chronic anxiety, high enough, really, I think the same differences that people could be curious about, become.
Walter's right now. Walter, right now I'm not hearing you as clearly as I was, like the last 30 seconds. Just the volume. I don't know if that has to do with your mic or. Let me hear you. Let me see.
No, something interrupted my signal. So.
Oh, there we go.
Are we back? Yeah.
We're back.
So I know.
We didn't miss much.
I know in marriage, so, you pick someone because they're not like you. In fact, they're kind of compliment you in ways. And it's not uncommon. And 5 years later, people are saying, God, she never talks. I wish she'd talk more. She's so quiet. Early on, it was, she's such a great listener, So, I do know that process is also reflecting something larger, but it may look like polarization as a simple, like two-person, two-sided process, but I think, again, it's another symptom of a larger process of chronic anxiety and acute anxiety, and how that impacts relationship networks, not just two, but other. But if you look at our society, you get this, it's easy to see with this Black Lives Matters movement, which is interesting that you get this polarization, which is emerging, each day as we go on with this. And kind of predictable in a society that tends to polarize lots of things like this. So that polarization would reflect something about chronic anxiety, but just what that is, I don't know. It does seem to be, is there more of it now than 20 years ago? I don't know. I don't even know how one gets objective about that. But I think in terms of racism, that is part of the larger process. I've been doing a lot of thinking about. Go ahead.
Just see if I'm tracking you, a kind of hidden chronic anxiety that's there, very pervasive in a group, and that the polarized nature of say, the very public battles between Law and Order and Black Lives Matter is a reflection of that.
That's the way I would read it. And it's some
of it.
And understanding that larger process, I think, is challenging for me. It's something I've been thinking a lot about, but can't quite put my finger on, but certainly thinking a lot about. Certainly, I would say child abuse as a symptom emerges in the midst of a long-term process going on in a family emotional system. And it sort of pops up, and then people would say, well, the child abuse started, on that day, back 10 years ago. But, it's only part of a larger process. Lots of other symptoms are also part of that process. And again, you'd have, families where there's high levels of chronic anxiety, that there's no child abuse, and then somebody loses a job, and then somebody else, has a prolonged illness, and so some acute events ramp it up, and then it emerges as a symptom. Does racism work like that? I don't know. It does appear that there's sort of this persistent. If you look at the outcome in health, mental health, child welfare, juvenile justice, lots of areas, you see these disproportionate outcomes based on race, not just African American, see it in Native American, see it in other ethnic groups, but it does show up. I don't know exactly, the process there. It does seem important to understand it as and one's going to, quote, do something about it. I've not been impressed with, I'm not saying they're not useful, but there's now a lot of diversity, equity, and inclusion training that goes on, so people go into corporations and people become more aware. There's some focus on implicit bias, becoming more aware of one's own unconscious bias. And I would say useful to some degree. I don't think it gets at the more underlying emotional process. So for example, in child welfare agency that I ran, we did, I thought, some pretty effective training on diversity, equity, inclusion of 600 staff. But I would say it didn't have much impact on the decision-making that I thought was racially biased. That took another process that was a little bit more complicated. So,
would you tell us a little about that? And by the way, I wanted to mention those listening, Walter's very interested in having a conversation. So we've chatted about this previous to this meeting, that this is going to be a conversation. But I like the idea of kind of warming it up with some of these interesting and, unusual perspectives. So would that be helpful, Walter? I'd be interested to hear That's so interesting that you didn't see diversity as inclusion training necessarily moving the needle that much, even though it was high quality training. But did you feel you did move it, and how? It seems like you're suggesting that
Yeah, I
some.
would say a couple of things that contributed, but don't anyone think that I know what exactly what happened. I'll just tell you my
Yeah.
best guesses. So decreasing racial bias decision making by looking at changed outcomes by 1/3 is not a small deal. Over a period of 2 years, the outcomes improved, changed. So one thing was my child welfare agency has 6 different offices that were fairly disconnected one from the other. So I would say in this organizational system, there was a fair amount of cutoff among offices. And managing that actually was a workout. But I would say over a period of 5 years, the degree of distance among these offices and also within offices decreased, which
Walter, I
initially
know.
increased tension, but I think in the long run actually allowed for leadership taking a clear position about improving or looking at asking people to be responsible for changing their decision making actually made it more effective. So I think in the past, leaders could say, I want this to happen, and then the officers would do what they did. But I think the reconnecting officers actually improved the ability for leadership to have influence over the functioning of each office. Now there's 600 people, each office is about 100 people. So we're talking about, fairly large offices, or not small offices. So I would say decreasing the amount of emotional distance in the relationship among the people in the organization worked. So would the corollary be? I would say our attitudes about sexual orientation changed as people became just more exposed to people who were of a different or various sexual orientations. I would say integration would be a good idea. Racial integration of neighborhoods and schools and workplaces would generally be a good idea. But ironically, we've probably become more racially segregated. We're as racially segregated now in schools as we were in the 1960s. But neighborhoods are pretty segregated. But I would say those segregations maybe help feed this.
Interesting.
So maybe that's part of the larger process. If I think I have to move to a suburb in order to be safe, and then I associate, some group with my lack of safety, and then there's a whole lot of people that just either live or see things the same way, that would help sustain it.
Interesting to think about emotional distance between these groups being a substantive feature of the problem.
And the emotional distance would be useful in the same way in child abuse. If you convince yourself, you and your co-parent, your spouse, that the problem in this family is that damn kid. If the kid would just quit acting like that, then we could just get that kid to be different, then this family would be a better place. Now, if you go in that direction, which is part of the projection process, boy, you could go a long way to rationalizing aggression of many kinds, many forms towards that kid. And and maybe, agreeing that the kid's the problem is a way of course, not taking personal responsibility for your part in it, or for other relationships being a part of it. But that would be a part of the progression program. If I can say my lack of safety is because of these groups, then it does reduce anxiety, which is tricky.
Boy, does that make sense. To achieve a state where one feels safe in this world is hard.
The other thing
And
I've been thinking a lot about, one of the other questions that I kind of have been wrestling with for several years now, but is my own family's response to race, the one I am a part of. You know, but I was thinking as we talked about police and police shootings, kind of this summer I've been thinking a lot about my interactions with the police and my family's response to me and my interactions with the police. I started driving when I was 16. And my ancestors on my mother's side after slavery bought land, 300 acres of land north of Pittsburgh back in about the year 1900. But that land and the people living on that land, who were African Americans, they sold off parcels to other families. It became the white suburbs. So when I grew up on that land, I actually grew up in the white suburbs, and people would say, what are you doing out here? And I would say, I've been here for a long time. But I remember, I started driving at 16, I can remember 4 times the police stopping me and escorting me out of white neighborhoods, saying, people don't want you in this neighborhood. And then at 19, I remember I was coming back from college with a couple of college mates to a town outside of Pittsburgh and getting pulled over and dragged to the police station and being there for about 2 or 3 hours until they decided we really were university students and they let us go. But I was remembering those incidents because where I live now, which is in the suburbs, certainly out of choice, but I live near the municipal building refueling station where the police cars go. And it's not uncommon for I'm driving down the road and there's a police car behind me. And I've been the last couple of years, I've been messing with the idea, do I know how to be tailed by the police and not have an anxious reaction? And the answer is no. Every time, there's just a sense of threat and not being safe that I know is rooted in not just those other experiences I've said, but other experiences. And I was thinking about how much emotional energy have I put into race because I see being African American in this, society at times is a threat. I think I mentioned first time, I've never walked into a meeting or a restaurant without scanning the environment, for threat related to race. And, just how much energy and effort goes into that. I know in my family, that certainly was, the family I grew up in talked about race all the time in terms of safety and managing safety. My father was very protective around race and was a real bulldog if he thought my brother or I were being discriminated against or the family was. My mother was a civil rights activist. So there was routine discussions about race and safety and how to be safe and how to manage that. I know nowadays we talk about this conversation that goes on between adolescent males and, their parents, but hell, that conversation happened all the time in the family I grew up in. And my mother was afraid to travel south of the Mason-Dixon line, and if I did, she would say, make sure you're safe. But, I've been just processing how much energy and effort goes into just, thinking about race if you're on the other end of the projection process. And what's the impact of that? How do you put that into this? African American, my colleagues and I talk about race all the time. But we don't talk about race when white people are around, which is interesting. I was just watching that one. So,
What do you think about that?
um, again, I think it's linked to threat, and it's linked to how does one survive. I think there's a certain amount of you're in this like I am, you know. I think that also perpetuates anxiety, So I think there's some degree of it being protective and some degree to which it perpetuates, anxiety. So it's an interesting one. But I would say I've often wondered. I wonder how many white people think about race. Just in terms of just on an everyday basis. I know my grandkids. My granddaughters yesterday went off to college just this a couple of weeks ago, and she was at college, and there was a big demonstration. And then she was saying, she was talking to some of her college co-eds, and they were remarked that, she had a lot of, thinking about, civil rights and race. And she said, well, every Sunday when we had family dinner, we would talk about race. We would talk about civil rights, or we would talk about, these kinds of things. I wonder, how, I just have thought, like, I wonder how, I know lots of people who are who look like me, who do think about it, talk about it, scan for it. And what does that reflect in terms of projection process? In child abuse, what can be sometimes the most damaging, I think sometimes people think the most damaging part of child abuse is the event of the aggressive act. And what I've tried to emphasize is, so it's not just that somebody hit you on a particular day, but just that after that day, for some kids, not all, they never felt safe in that family again.
Mm.
And so every time somebody's voice, went up or got angry, it triggered anxiety. So it's not just this thing happened on this day, or that the police pulled me over at 19, but that every time after that, when a police car is behind me, it's in my nervous system that I may not be safe. So, and I think in terms of my understanding and the way I think about Bowen theory, it's that more chronic anxiety that's really that can be the most difficult to work with.
It'll hurt you every minute.
I'm with you. And then what do you do when chronic anxiety is useful? Because I would say sometimes it seems like, being cautious in a society that's out to literally, put their foot on your neck is sometimes not a bad strategy.
Very interesting about how the conversation stops if a white person enters. I was thinking, Walter, that I'm sure it's true that I have thought a lot less about race than you. A lot of talk about different differences. And also that if a conversation was happening about race between me and some white friend of mine and a black person came in, typically that would stiffen it up. And I would be thinking, this is dangerous, which is not helping.
One of the things we did in child welfare, and that worked pretty well, was to have we had 1,300 people in different meetings for about 3 hours at a time, just having conversations about race, and so create an environment where people could just talk about it.
Is this different than diversity inclusion training?
We use that training to actually have open conversations that were, and I said to the trainers, you cannot rev it up. It's got to be low-key conversations where people can say, as much as possible what they want to say, and we discourage reactivity. So it wasn't going to be somebody says something and somebody else stands up and says, "Oh my God, how could you say that?" It was real, they were pretty good. And people would say, "That's the best conversation I ever had about race." So that was some of the reviews we would get.
Hmm.
So I would say that's part of the process,
Yeah.
in terms of what's in there.
And there may be
I
a lot.
don't know how that's part of the process, but I think that's part of it.
Well, I find it, I think some people are very skilled at creating a conversation where there's actually person-to-person contact. And that's one of the core skills of a Bowen trained family therapist. And you could sit with a couple and you could foster an atmosphere where the person-to-person contact is going to happen. Or just one person, and you're going to just have person-to-person contact with that person. And a polarized dialogue is very, very far away from that.
It was helpful for me to do that with my parents first, which I thought was just a workout.
You need to have a person-to-person with them
with my mother
period.
about anything.
About anything.
Without it getting polarized. So that was a workout. But I do think that's part of the process. I don't know. I was watching a movie the other day about the truth trials in South Africa.
Mm-hmm.
Some effort to try to just talk about what happened without getting into blame and punishment. Some effort to do that. So anyway, I think there's probably different ways to go at this. I don't think it's as simple as just passing policies and laws, and although that may be part of the process, I don't think it's that simple. And then the larger question I'll keep asking, which I'll keep wondering about, is there a way to calm down a symptom without escalating anxiety in the process? I don't know.
That circles around to that challenging insight that you shared about child abuse, that it's a stabilizer. So you could go and disrupt that stabilizer, and maybe there's consequences to that you're not paying attention to. And that something similar may be going on with racism.
I think there's something to do that, something about that in some families. I won't say all, but I do think symptoms as a binder of anxiety, I would stick to. I think generally they are, and I would assume racism is a symptom. So then it makes me wonder about what is that larger process. Could it be that part of, I asked myself this question: can you find a social group that does not project onto some of its members? I haven't found one yet, but I'm still working at that one.
Could you find one that doesn't even do it for one day?
Okay, I like that. I like that question. I don't know. I mean, is it that built into the process? Is it that naturally occurring that some of this is probably there are groups that don't do that. I haven't seen them, and it's not unusual for differences to end up being part of the projection process.
And it is inspiring to be around people who are strikingly good at not doing that. And when you watch a moment, this is part of what was so interesting to me about Dr. Ann Bunting when I first met her, is just watching her in an intense interaction, say, with our board, and just seeing her make a move and noticing she's kind of outside of this intensity. And that just, oh man, did that get my attention. and is probably one of the big reasons why I've stayed on this for 25 years, and then seeing other people do it.
Yeah, there does seem to be, some people that can be in the midst of this intensity and not take or make it personal, and just have a way of being there, see it for what it is, and not be as reactive to the emotional process. Um, However, there also seems to be almost in any group somebody who's able to do that more than the others. So then the question becomes: is that also a typical role in groups, or is that something about the individual? I would venture to say not only would in most groups is there a projection process? There probably is somebody that's a little bit above it in that group. And, I think in families that I've interviewed where there's child abuse, there's always been somebody who sees it and sees it more for a little bit more objectively than everybody else, which I would say would be a great position for that person to lead. So not a bad place for a leader to be in. It's not always the case. Sometimes the most aggressive person is the one that takes over. But if you can get that person to be the one that can guide things, you're probably a little better off in the group. So I don't have that many personal heroes, but Martin Luther King did a pretty good job of trying to stay a little bit above just the polarization, and when it came to race, and to be in that role where you're trying to do something about it and you can stay above it, pretty good.
I'm so pleased that we celebrate his emotional process. So, Walter, maybe it's a good point. You think so to maybe interact a little bit with the group who's been listening?
Sounds good. Yeah,
getting said. Maybe we do that a little first, and then we go into breakouts.
I'll follow your lead on it.
I have a question. This is Connie Seraphin.
Go ahead, Connie.
To not project when you're in a group with a lot of different people, I was just thinking that would it be helpful just to try to be curious, try to have a mindset that is just curious about why other people are talking differently or have different perspectives. Like, where does that come from? I'm trying to do that even in my family, because we're raised in the same family, very secure family, and yet we have a lot of differences. And I'm just trying to figure how can I be curious about examining that?
I think it's a good question to kind of ask and to hold each of us to. Because I do think being curious, being innovative, being creative requires one to manage anxiety, because it's hard to be anxious and to be curious, highly anxious, and to be curious at the same time. So the rejection process, I think, is bigger than this, though. It's bigger than just what, an individual may put themselves to. I would venture to say, and, maybe people can say they haven't, but I know I've been in a position of projecting blame to others. And boy, it's a slippery thing to get into. It happens so easily. Try not to do it in marriage, Try not to do it. Try not to do it in a group when you're in the one-up position. Boy, it's a tough one. And it's an easy position to get into, but I think it has more to do with the overall anxiety in the system. But yeah, if you're going to make an individual effort at this, I think it's not a bad way to go at it, which is to, push oneself to get curious instead of being so threatened. but one has to watch. So sometimes being threatened is the right response. So one has to be careful.
And if I could just add, it's okay, Erik?
Yeah, go ahead, Thomasina.
On the question of being curious, I think being curious is something we always suggest that people do when they're trying to think systems. That I think should encompass not only being curious about what the other person is thinking, what may be going on with them, but also curious about our questions. Why we are curious about the things that we're curious about, particularly as it relates to an issue of race. For example, I've had people literally come up and touch my hair because they're curious about what my hair feels like, or why my hair is different. I've had people ask me questions about what happens when my family has dinner, as though it would be different than anybody else's family when they have dinner. So I think curiosity about the other person, but curiosity also in terms of understanding my own functioning and my own reactivity as to what I'm curious about and why that might be the case.
Well said.
Thank you, Tom. Walter, you have any comments on that? What do you think about this sort of, I think a lot of white people worry, and, you know, touching someone's hair seems so obviously rude to me. But I think I see a lot of anxiety in my peers, white peers, about, I'm going to mess this up. If I go in here, if I go into this space, and that's their anxiety, but it contributes, I think, to the emotional distance. So I don't know. What do you think about that?
I think that's part of the anxiety about race, and part of the distance that we can sustain about in our relationships around this issue. I'm not sure the distance always has to do with race, but I think it gets played out with race. I would again go back to this idea it may have to do with anxiety over differences, and many different kinds of differences in our society trigger, distance. I think the idea about curiosity to me is, when differences emerge, can you get curious about them instead of, reactive in a polarizing way to them? And maybe I think as an individual, can make that effort. So, but I do think the idea of, like, just because I'm curious, does that, what is that? One has to look at what do you mean by that? I mean,
maybe
you can ask a question in a way when you're curious that it's offensive, or you can ask a question that's really one of inquiry. You can cross boundaries, interpersonal boundaries that are inappropriate for the sake of curiosity.
Yeah, maybe makes me think about a kind of anxious curiosity. So maybe it's a combination of the non-anxious presence.
I know as an African American, I don't want to be in a position of explaining to other people what it's like to be African American. I don't think it's impossible for anybody to figure out what it's like to be African American. It's not like something strange. We're some strange animals that you've never seen before, and you have to sort of ask about. I mean, I think, and there's lots of work people can do to learn about the African American experience instead of, making me the expert to explain to them.
I have a question.
Go ahead.
I'm wondering if there's anything in the automaticity of the togetherness process, like that inevitable sort of like force of gravity of togetherness. Is there something in that is about togetherness that is automatically about togetherness apart from another group, that the togetherness sort of defines one group of people in relation to another, that they're not together?
I'm not sure I know exactly what you mean. I mean, I generally like the direction you're going. So I would venture to say that part of being opposed to another group is also being more fused in your own group. So those two things kind of parallel each other often. I think I said last time on this, for a while, I decided to read about white supremacy groups And it's interesting to read about how much fusion there is within the group, and how much polarization between the group and other groups there is. And I think those things go together. I think it happens in families quite a bit.
I have a question.
Sure, go ahead.
Oh yeah, thank you. One of the things that struck me when you were saying that when Black folks are having a conversation about race among themselves and a white person shows up, the conversation stops and so forth. And one of the things that I was curious about on some level is that if a person sort of like has moved sort of up their level of differentiation of self, would that not have a contributing factor to be able to continue that conversation even in the midst of the presence of white people or whatever, even if it's a threat, given the fact that this is about your principles, about your life, this is who you are? Why stop that?
Yeah, I think it could. I think I was trying to describe, and I don't know what your experience is, just what I see happen. But yeah, I certainly have pushed myself to try to function where I talk about what I talk about, whether I'm talking, with my African American colleagues and friends and family members, or with my white colleagues and friends and family members. I can't always do that, so maybe that does reflect my level of differentiation. But yeah, I would say in general, there does appear to be some conversations we have with each other that we don't have with the other. And maybe that reflects lower functioning. I think your question's implying that. But I could go along with that. But I think that's what I see. I once had I don't know if I described this last time or not. I've talked about it recently. I used to do conferences on African American families and their functioning. And I had this one meeting of 100 people there. Everyone in the room was African American. So I said, this is the first time I've ever been to a conference where the whole group was African American. So how about if we talk about race among ourselves as African Americans? And we had about the longest 3-hour meeting I've ever had in which African Americans were talking about racial bias within our group and not between us and others. And it was really fascinating. It was great. People talk about skin color, hair texture, and, class status. And so within the group of African Americans, as African Americans will tell you, there's a whole lot of projection that goes on within the group. So it's not like it's just between groups. But I said to that group, could we ever have this conversation if there was half the room was white? And everyone said no. Not everyone. Most people said no. I can't say everyone because I didn't pull everyone, but I'd say most people said no. But there does appear to be different kinds of conversations that people have about this, depending on who's around. And maybe we could all do better about that. I generally don't talk about the racial bias around skin color that I see among African Americans with white people. I can tell you I don't do that. Not that I couldn't, but I don't. Now, if you ask me about it, I could tell you about it, but I'm not sure it's a conversation that's easily had.
You're doing it right now, Walter Smith.
I figured that, yes.
Walter, I think we should do a little breakout process. I think there's a lot of very interesting ideas. We could keep rolling with this, but I want to give everyone in this meeting a chance to share and think out loud with some people. And so I'm going to structure that process now via the Zoom app. And it's a little tricky because you might be one person out there saying, I don't really want to do that right now. So there's a number of ways you could handle that. I think there is a way within Zoom you can control and you can move yourself out of the meeting. If you look around on your screen, I think it's in the top right corner. You might find that control if you'd like to get out of the conversation. Another way is you could just simply just say, I'd like to be silent. But I keep getting the feedback that this is valuable for people, so we'll keep doing it until I hear otherwise. So what's going to happen is Zoom is going to, I'm going to share a slide that I created with some guidance that I think is valuable about how to think about this brief breakout conversation. Will be about 10 minutes, maybe just a little short of that. Suggest that, you don't, it's not really a time to it's going to be on Zoom, at least for the start of the year. And the Zoom option will be available to people for the whole year. So that's still something people could look into. You can learn more about that on our website. Also, that we have this YouTube channel. So all these, the Stuck Together series, which we've now changed the title to Free Together, they're all on this YouTube channel that's easy to find if you just Google our organization's name. And again, just want to invite you to consider making a donation to the organization. This picture here shows you what we're about, trying to strengthen families, strengthen communities, strengthen organizations. How do we do it? By training family therapists and advisors. I see a great need out there for people in the field of therapy and well beyond all the helping professions to have an exposure to Bowen family systems theory. So we're trying to provide that. And by supporting us, that's what you'll be helping us do. And here are our upcoming events. I'll just let you look at that for a sec. Again, promoting this conference that we're going to be doing, a 2-day conference in October, 9 to 3 each day, trying to make it manageable to do via Zoom. And we're going to have an interesting interdisciplinary adventure on what is the self, what about the self state of healthy separateness, what's its relationship to mindfulness, what's its relationship to inner silence, with some people who've done empirical research on these things. Okay. Walter, how are you doing?
Doing well, thank you. It's been an interesting time. My head's full of questions. So.
For some reason, your screen is tilted so that...
yeah, someone else noticed that too. I'm sideways.
So
don't know what to do about it. Maybe it's the conversation. How about this? Does this help?
Upside down, you could try.
Yeah. You brought it on.
Somebody asked a question. I like this simple, basic questions. I like beginner questions. The word projection has been thrown around a lot. As a pastor, I'm not trained as a therapist. I'm interested in the way you would define this word projection.
Yeah, I think we're talking about a process which would involve a sequence of things that happen. And descriptively, one of the ways in which anxiety can be managed in a family is anxiety increases. It could be that some family members focus concern, worry, upsetness towards another family member, and it increases the anxiety in the family member of focus and tends to decrease anxiety in the people who are focusing. So as a process, it's that's one way to see it. So parents, I saw a family the other day where the parents said, I'm not worried about our marriage, I'm worried about that oldest kid of ours. As if, we could just do something about the oldest kid, then the marriage would be okay. That would be a way of thinking about how anxiety shifts from one relationship and shifts into others.
Thank
It
you.
would not be a way of using the intrapsychic use of the term projection, which is something different. That's the way I would describe it.
Walter, another person asks, how much of the polarization that we see in society do you think has to do with the environment, to climate change and fears and scarcities, scarcity about water, land, migration, things like that? Is it that, or is it even bigger than this, the person asked?
It's a really great question, and it's worth someone pursuing. The general idea, I would say, is that as threats and challenges increase in families or for society, our ability to adapt to them and to manage them has some limitation. And over and above our limited ability to adapt, then you start to see these other ways of managing anxiety that come to bear. So, so could it be that climate change is the kind of threat that drives up anxiety in society, and it surpasses our ability to adapt to it? So then focusing on race or a group and is useful because it manages anxiety that we struggle with and adapting to something basic like climate change. So that would be the idea, the hypothesis. Now, going about trying to demonstrate that, this person who asked that question could do that, I would really appreciate it.
Walter,
They could write a paper and do a presentation on it. I would really appreciate it.
One thing I really like about talking to you is how much you emphasize what you don't know. I just find that really opens up the conversation. Randy Frost had a question earlier. Randy, do you want to jump in here and ask your question? Love to hear from you.
Well, I had the good fortune to land in the same small group with Walter, so I was able to pose it there, and there may be others who want to ask questions before we have to wind down. I'm opposed to asking it again, but I had a chance.
That's generous of you. Thank you. Walter, somebody else asked about leadership, and following up on what you mentioned earlier about what you did in your organization, the efforts that you made to address racism in your organization. Somebody wanted to know, well, after trying the diversity inclusion training process, then what next? What happened next? Have you got any more to share with us about your thoughts about that topic of leadership in an organization or in society in general? You mentioned Martin Luther King.
I would say, and this would be completely skewed by my training and perspective. I was joking earlier about an effort to work on oneself and family is basic and important to, I think, a Bowen family systems perspective on leadership and how does one lead change, how does one work at this stuff. And that experience for me was invaluable in thinking about organization leadership. The first thing I had to really work at in my family was, how do I establish really good person-to-person contact with as many family members as I could before trying to do any fancy maneuvers, like grow up and be more mature and address difficult topics. And it's the same sort of process in an organization. I spent a great deal of time establishing with 600 people, which is an interesting thing in itself, as good person-to-person relationships as I could before addressing, not exactly before, but certainly that became the focus early on as part of this process. And so the diversity, equity, inclusion training was actually a sidebar to that. But I think it did open up, how do you have a conversation about, talking with my mother about, you know, her marriage to my father was far more challenging than talking about race and child welfare. And I would say talking about race and child welfare was a lot easier after talking to my mother about her marriage to my father. So, and not to say if you can do one, you can automatically do the other. It's just to say there is this way of approaching this, which is you first get humbled by your family, and then everything else looks a little simpler.
I've been quoting you for years. When you came to Vermont years ago, you said something like, differentiation. What's differentiation? Differentiation involves a certain way that you might be able to function when you're in the presence of your mother, who is criticizing directly you, the way you look. To be not personalizing it, to be staying curious, to be whatever, all the different list of things that it would involve.
I'm with you.
So, somebody else asked, you mentioned Dr. King. Is there anybody you see in the national landscape now of a public voice who you think is doing a pretty good job of leading on this topic?
I haven't thought about it. I don't think much about it. I only have a few people that another one of my personal heroes was Stephen Hawking, because, I just always thought it's pretty remarkable to be at that level of science with that much challenge. I just have always been impressed. It says something about functioning. I'm not sure if it says about differentiation or not, but it says something about functioning. But I haven't had, I don't sort of look around for that. I'm thinking much more not about individuals, but much more about societal emotional process as indicated by maybe what individuals do, but largely what groups do. And I pulled out King because, I don't think leaders are out there all by themselves. I think leaders also reflect, the process they're a part of, the groups they're a part of. And I often say, when I look at the civil rights photographs from years ago, I'm as impressed by the people behind King as I am by him. Because those people that marched with him lost their job and they lived in some little southern city and maybe never had a job again. And that was one hell of a thing to do, to take a position like that at a time like that. So I think oftentimes leaders reflect the groups that they're leading. Yeah. And there's some individuality in there that we should recognize and appreciate. But sometimes I think we see it the other way, which is the leader, and the groups behind them. I think it's probably much more the leaders are just one role in the group and with some individuality really stand out.
Walter, it's very good talking to you. Anybody else? We got some minutes left. Who else would like to make a comment, share an observation? We've got probably a chance for one more, maybe two more before we wrap this thing up in about 3 minutes.
I had a question. One of the things that I wanted to ask, and I put it in the comments, is just like in what you were talking about, societal regression, the emotional process and so forth. And what we had someone in our group that made a very good observation from South Africa and so forth. So it got me thinking, what role, if any, do you see the use of propaganda in contributing to social anxiety and social regression? Because he talked about in South Africa, it was like state-sponsored, basically propaganda to raise race tensions and all that kind of stuff. So, just curious.
Yeah, I have no doubt that there are efforts made to propagate and increase our focus on race and racism. Obviously, propaganda as part of that. There's lots of other things that are part of that. you know, as people know, Ronald Reagan made crime have a black face back when he did the crime stuff back in the 80s, which really made a difference in terms of the institutionalization of African Americans, particularly African American males. So I do think that's in there. I mean, I think there are propaganda, I think would be part of aggression, would be part of the aggressive acts that society takes that's in the projection process. And it would be part of convincing people there really is something wrong with a particular group or a person. I know in child abuse, you know, you talk to a parent, you know, I can't tell you how many parents said to me, well, what was I supposed to do? That kid was just a bad kid, you know, and they would try to do everything they could to convince you that the problem was the kid. And I think propaganda has a tendency to do that. So it's part of the process. And so an important point that was made in your group.
Erik, those of us who were not in Dr. Smith's group would love to hear his answer and thoughts to Randy Frost's question.
I think people should hear Randy's question. It was an excellent question.
Okay.
And so, yeah,
Let's
it's
close
worth
up with
hearing.
that. We have 2 minutes, and I do want to let people go in time. So, Randy, if you could give it to us in a concise, and let's get a quick thought from Walter on it.
Okay, just real quickly, Dr. Smith noted that getting rid of a symptom like child abuse in a family can trigger a heightened chronic anxiety and lead to other symptoms. The same thing he suggested could happen in society as one group wiggles out from a degree of projection process, and then where does that chronic anxiety go? So my question was, what variables for those trying to modify symptoms, whether it's in the family or in society, accompany an effort that results in more basic change and not just heightening chronic anxiety and leading to other kinds of symptoms? That's the short version.
Thank you, Randy.
I think the question should stand on its own without any response from me. It's that good. It's that good.
Well, you've asked a lot of questions during this hour and a half, Walter, and that's you know, I just found there's something about this conversation that I really appreciate, and I do want to thank you for taking the time to share both your insights and wisdoms, but just your presence, which includes the questions. And I agree with you. Randy's question is excellent. What does it take to lead real change? One of the reasons why I love being around the Bowen theory community, because you get questions like that, a very deep dive into what does it take to drive real change. And I think we've had a wonderful hour and a half on that topic today.
I do want to say thank you to you, Erik, for this interview and for both of them on a really difficult topic. It keeps me on my toes. You've kept me on my toes, which I appreciate. But it's been an honor and opportunity just to kind of show up and try to be at my best. So thanks.
Would you consider doing another one in a couple months?
Maybe more like 4 or 5 months.
You think? Give it some thought. I'll follow up.
All right, sounds good.
Okay, 4 or 5 months. Bye, folks. Have a good afternoon.
Take care.